Thank you, Alexandra, for that summary. Just as a bit of minuscule history, when Bowden first suggested this to members of the board of the World Academy, I remained somewhat silent. And the reason I remained silent was that I was a student activist in the 1960s. And I was very aware of some of the debates about the scope of human freedom and the concern of many eminent intellectuals and scholars at the time that essentially society was composed of immense duties. And these duties ultimately reflected the repression of human freedom, whether it was in the area of sexual relations or politics or whatever. And one of the themes that struck me personally was the notion that we have an obligation to respect the law of the state. And I was a political exile from the apartheid state of South Africa, which was at that time one of the most racist on the planet. And the state had codified the most racist principles that it could imagine and then put them into law. So was this an obligation on my part to respect laws that were on their face manifest and disgraceful injustices? So this is not a simple problem, but I just wanted to, I had an initial reaction to the notion that maybe we're underplaying duties in the current state of the recognition of the essential dimensions of human freedom. So I had some reservations about this, but I also am a practical lawyer and I'm aware of the issue in law that almost every legal principle comes with a correlative. You can't have a right unless there's a duty, to put it bluntly. And so I wanted to give this a little bit more thought. And so I did initially respond, incidentally, to this draft by looking at the draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There the rights are. So the question is, what are the correlative duties of these rights? And that was quite easy to do. I could trace the entire declaration and state the obligations entailed by the rights. I thought that might be a more promising way to go about, although it's more complex and results in 35 rather than 15 articles. But anyway, let me get to the paper itself. For over 2,000 years in the Western legal tradition, we grappled with the notion of a higher law, sometimes, at least in Roman times, described as the jus naturale, and during a later period under the influence of Catholic theologians, the idea of natural law. However, the content and the procedures of natural law tended to be limited, often open-ended and vague. Theorists tried to explain natural law as a product of the faculty of human reason, which was a gift from God. Now, go from Aquinas to 1941. President Roosevelt presented to the Congress of the United States a document known as the Atlantic Charter. The Charter anticipated the United States' entry into the war, and Roosevelt, being a practical idealist, considered that to send men and women into battle and risk their lives required that they enter into the zone of human conflict with an understanding that their sacrifice was for something worthwhile. This element of the worthwhile was reflected in what came to be known as the Four Freedoms, which he considered to be the purpose for which the war was being fought. These four freedoms were the freedom from fear, freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of conscience and belief, and the freedom from want. This latter dimension of freedom was one he found to be vital, to be a vital aspect of the experience of man in society. As he put it, necessitous human beings are really not free. The four freedoms became the conceptual and normative basis of the United Nations Charter. The Charter is commonly deemed to be our global constitution. In the preamble, in the first chapter of the Charter, the concept of human rights is mentioned several times as one of the pillars upon which the Charter is founded. In short, the Charter makes the concept of human rights a constitutional precept in the framework of global public order. Now, we should be reminded that the foundations of the Charter are to be found in the four freedoms codified in the Atlantic Charter. They developed a consensus among the principal participators in the early United Nations process that there needed to be, there was a need to express more clearly and in greater detail what the constitutional precept of human rights actually encompassed. Truman nominated Eleanor Roosevelt to serve on the drafting committee, and she soon chaired that committee. In what can only be described as a miracle of draftsmanship, within a few years, the committee presented a draft of an instrument identified as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From the perspective of the framework of global values, the UDHR was an unprecedented instrument. In a historic flash, the concept of human rights was given both form and content. The document was impressive both for its particularity and for its comprehensiveness. Doubtless the speed of its production benefited from the guidance of the normative values encased in the four freedoms of the Atlantic Charter. This single instrument generated a sea change in our thinking realistically about the proper identification of participators in the world's social power and constitutional processes. The conventional wisdom of international law and international relations provided juridical and political space largely to the sovereign, territorially organized body politic. The UDHR made a sweeping implicit claim that the most important unit in the global system of public order is the individual human being. Thus, the individual is not merely an object of international law and international relations processes. By clothing the individual in a comprehensive framework of individual rights, the individual is in effect given the opportunity to become a subject of international law and international relations. As a subject of international law, the individual comes armed with a framework of internationally approved fundamental rights. From this perspective, the UDHR is a revolutionary contribution to both international law and international relations. The instrument explains the concept behind the values of human rights and relates it to the concept of a rights-based framework of entitlements. From time to time, questions have emerged concerning the nature of the rights in human rights and the further concern that the rights-based approach does not express with sufficient clarity what the appropriate and prudent limitations with regard to these formulations of right are. First, we need to clarify an obvious ambiguity. The Declaration was adopted in the form of a General Assembly resolution. In general, such resolutions are not technically legally binding. In this sense, states voting for the resolution may have believed that they were voting for the support of a moral obligation and not a legally binding obligation. The ambiguity emerges when we consider that the human rights precept itself is explicitly included in the text of the UN Charter, and therefore the principle of human rights has a legally binding stature. If this is correct, then the Declaration as a resolution is in reality the extrapolation of a pre-existing constitutional obligation. This may be analogous to the role of the American Supreme Court, which extrapolates meanings of the Constitution, for example, the 14th Amendment, which deals with equality before the law, and Additionally, the General Assembly Declaration could be seen as simply more than a moral or ethical expression of a desire. It could be that the resolution represents something more. The salience of the Universal Declaration in identifying the centrality of the human person in the global social process is a recognition of the critical role of human capital centered in the human person in improving the human prospect. The central commitment of the Declaration is the confidence it places in human capacity and potential. This means that human rights underscores the importance of unleashing human energy, curiosity, initiative, innovation, and creativity as the most critical components of social development and an improvement of the human prospect. The example of an explicit public articulation of fundamental rights is no better illustrated than in the American Declaration of Independence. The power of such principles as all human beings are created equal generated for us personalities who significantly changed the world. Consider the contributions of Abraham Lincoln, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and more recently Nelson Mandela. These leaders inspired, along with countless generations of impoverished immigrants who, for example, came to the United States to improve their human prospects. They saw an opportunity to acquire property, valid political space, access to education, participation in civil society, and to join in the struggle to replace arbitrary government by governance based on justice and fairness. The central role of human rights symbolizes in human development should also be understood as providing the underlying justification for Franklin Roosevelt's proposal to expand our fundamental concept of justice from the political to the economic sphere. This challenge is essentially one about fundamental values of global salience that should guide a new paradigm of thinking and action. When we examine the notion of universal human rights, we look back on the role of religious ideals relating to the human condition. For example, in the Jewish tradition, the Ten Commandments essentially reflect 10 important religiously defined values. Furthermore, the fundamental ethical principle that is to guide the Jewish spiritual ideal is the duty to cleave to God's ways. For example, there's a duty to be merciful because God is merciful. There's a duty to be gracious because God is gracious. In this tradition, there is a duty to search for the truth. Since this is a search for the seal of God, it would appear that the ideal life devotes itself to such a search. In the Hindu tradition, the individual comes to life with a framework of guidance known as the Dharma. Essentially, the Dharma consists of duties that the individual life must embrace in order to fulfill the expectations of Dharma. In Islam, the Quran also specifies what is permissible and what is absolutely forbidden. In the system of jurisprudence developed in the Sharia, the law is specific about duties that the individual must embrace to be a good Muslim. In the context of Buddhism, Buddha provided a pathway to enlightenment in which he basically said there is a duty to avoid suffering. Suffering was the thing that animated the Buddha, and there's a duty to avoid it. If you want to be a holy person, don't go through some terrible and excruciating pains to be holy. Avoid unnecessary suffering. The pathway, therefore, is replete with notions of duty. In the modern tradition, it has long been recognized that legal and moral rights come in pairs of complementary opposites. The great challenges in law require the working through of these paradoxes. To provide a simple illustration, in the law of treaties in international law, there's a powerful principle, pacta sunt servanda, or pax binding. But in the law of treaties, there's another principle, rebus sic stantibus. When circumstances change, the treaty is no longer binding. If I took you through some ordinary contract law, there are rules that tell you how to make a deal and rules that tell you how to break a deal. Run side by side. In the law of contract, we have offer, acceptance, intention to create legal relations, and so on. And then the rules that tell you how to break a deal: fraud, common mistake, duress, failure of consideration. It's therefore important that we clarify the role of obligations and responsibilities that exist alongside the clarification of rights. In our academy, of course, Professor Bodan Horsweiler has provided us with 15 principles which he styles human obligations. And they have virtues. For one, it's only 15 principles. They're short. They're easy to digest. And so a relevant target audience would find this not difficult to understand. Second, it is actually based on some recent theories about the nature of justice itself. For example, the late Professor Dawkins starts with the notion that every human being has an ethical obligation, that his life is to be a successful experience and not a wasted opportunity. In other words, all of us have an ethical obligation that the authentic self owes to the self to not waste your life, okay? To make it a reasonably successful experience. Then the question is, if that is an ethical principle that's valid for the self, why shouldn't it also be valid for every non-self other out there? From that you can convert an ethical principle into a very powerful moral principle that justifies the theory of justice. So Boden's idea then of responsibility certainly has a connection to this very modern idea about life, or the ethical foundation of life, not being a wasted experience, but a successful and appropriate one. So with that, and with that idea of the wasted experience, the challenge that we have is, one, is it of value to state these responsibilities, and if so, how should we state them? Now, as I said, Boden's is very useful. It's 14, it's easy to understand, and so on. But on the other hand, it may be better if we look at the document itself, the Universal Declaration, and look at each article and ask ourselves, okay, here's the article, what is the obligation, what is the responsibility, what is the duty that is entailed by it? At least that is a model that's a bit more complex, and I went through the Universal Declaration and emerged, I'm afraid, with 39 articles of responsibilities or duties. So, but on the other hand, my 39 duties track the fundamental document itself, so that there is a certain symmetry about rights and responsibilities in an authorized document that already pre-exists any new promotion of specific human responsibilities. In any event, she's gone through the provisions that are recommended by our colleague in the World Academy, and I would just take 3 or 4 from my own recommendation. Article 1, every human being has a responsibility to respect the equal dignity and freedom of every other human being in the spirit of human solidarity. This is taken from the Declaration. Everyone has the obligation, that's 3, to respect the freedom, security, and life of all other human beings. Everyone has a responsibility to refrain from putting others in slave-like practices. Everyone has a duty to promote the rights of others to fair treatment under the law, and so on and so on. So, anyway, I think it is an important debate, although I'm not so sure how important it is, but that's something that we could probably take up in the discussion. If it's important, then how should we express it? Should we track the Universal Declaration or just have a short statement as Alexander has given us? But those at least, seems to me, are some of the issues that we could think about and talk about. Thank you.